In the summer of 2001, a 13-year-old shepherd girl named Amelia disappeared without a trace in the misty hills of northern Oregon. The search turned up nothing, no footprints, no belongings, no final word. But 22 years later, her grieving father returns to the forest she vanished in, and what he finds buried beneath the moss changes everything they thought they knew about that day. The morning mist hung low over the hills of Galloway, casting a ghostly hue over the emerald landscape. The sun had just begun to rise, smearing pale gold across the sky like butter on fresh bread. Mark Ford stood at the doorstep of his modest cottage, mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, watching the silhouette of his daughter Amelia fade into the distance. She was only 13, but determined beyond her years, and today was her first day leading the sheep without supervision. "You sure she's ready?" his wife Helen had asked the night before, concern creasing the corners of her mouth. Mark had nodded, with the easy confidence of a father who believed in trial by fire. "It's time. She's smart, careful. She knows the path better than anyone." He had tried to ignore the knot in his stomach as he said it. Amelia whistled softly, tapping her stick gently against her boots as the sheep obeyed her lead. She loved the quiet of the hills, the way the world seemed paused up here, like a breath held in reverence. The wind was soft that morning, brushing her auburn curls from her cheek. Her backpack, filled with a sandwich, a compass, and a tattered notebook, bounced gently against her spine as she climbed. She wasn't scared. She was proud. Her father had trusted her, and she intended to prove him right. But something felt off. By mid-morning, the mist hadn't lifted. If anything, it thickened, a strange, unmoving fog that blanketed the ridge in a way Amelia hadn't seen before. Her sheep had started acting skittish, veering closer to her legs than usual, their beats sharper, more anxious. Amelia paused near the edge of a narrow footpath that curved along the eastern slope. Normally, the trail was dry and firm, but today the ground beneath her boots felt softer, damp. She hesitated. That was the last time anyone saw Amelia Ford. By late afternoon, Mark began to worry. She should have been back hours ago. The sheep usually grazed a few miles up the hill and returned by noon. He called a few neighbors. They waited until 3. At 4, he called the police. Search teams scoured the area for days. Drones buzzed overhead, sniffed through bramble and moss. Mark himself wandered the hills for hours, voice hoarse from calling his daughter's name into the wind. Then, on the 4th morning, a deputy named Ellis found something, one of Amelia's boots, partially buried near what looked like a natural indentation in the soil. It was muddy, the earth around it torn as if from movement, but not enough to suggest a landslide. A local geologist was brought in. He shook his head. "Not a slide," he confirmed. "The ground hasn't shifted, no fault lines here. The disturbance is isolated. Whatever happened, it wasn't natural." There was no blood, no torn fabric, just a lone boot facing uphill, as if Amelia had been walking towards something. That detail haunted Mark. The media came, then vanished just as quickly. "Teenage girl disappears during shepherding duty," the headlines read, often followed by the word tragedy. But the word that stuck with Mark the most came from an older farmer named George. Odd, he'd lived on these hills for 50 years and had never seen mist linger like that. "Well, like the mountain didn't want her to leave," he whispered one evening over pints. Weeks became months. Seasons changed. Posters faded. The trail went cold. Helen tried to move on, clinging to the routines of daily life. She stopped saying Amelia's name out loud. Mark, however, couldn't let go. He still walked the hills every Sunday, retracing her usual route. One evening, nearly a year later, while cleaning out Amelia's room, Mark found something curious. A crumpled note in the front pocket of a coat she hadn't worn in months. Written in her careful, looping script were the words, "Don't worry, I'll be back before dinner." That part was normal. But underneath, in a hurried, almost panicked scrawl that wasn't her usual style, were 3 more words. "Don't follow me." He didn't know what to make of it. Had she been planning something? A prank? An escape? And then came the nightmares. Mark began dreaming of Amelia standing in the mist, barefoot, calling his name. Each time he woke, he swore he could still hear her voice, echoing faintly through the trees. The town of Galloway grew quiet about her, as if forgetting was easier than not knowing. But Mark couldn't forget. He wouldn't. The hills still held her, he believed. And somewhere, somehow, they would tell him the truth. By the time a full week had passed since Amelia's disappearance, the search had transitioned from organized urgency to desperate persistence. Volunteers, police officers, and local hunters joined in, creating a patchwork grid of effort across the green expanse of the Galloway Hills. Still, every passing day eroded hope, like wind slowly erasing footprints in sand. Mark Ford, hollow-eyed and gaunt from sleepless nights, refused to stay home. He walked with the searchers, called out his daughter's name until his voice cracked and his throat bled raw. He knew she was out there, not gone, just hidden. Somehow. It was during one of those exhaustive sweeps that Sergeant David Kearns, a seasoned officer with a background in forestry, noticed something curious near the western boundary of the mapped search area. It was a section of brush so dense that it looked impassable at first glance, overgrown with thistle and tangled vines, but the way the moss had been disturbed, like it had been recently parted, caught his eye. He pushed forward, clearing away the growth with his gloved hands. Beneath it, he uncovered a narrow footpath barely wide enough for a child. The earth was firm and oddly dry. A deer trail, perhaps? But the settled indentation of human prints suggested otherwise. Kearns marked the location and radioed the team, his voice tight with restrained adrenaline. The path curved westward, vanishing into the restricted section of Galloway Forest National Reserve, a zone barred to public access due to fragile ecological conditions and unstable terrain. This wasn't part of the original map, Kearns noted to his superior, pointing at the faded topographic sheet spread over the hood of a patrol car. No one searched past this perimeter. It's technically off-limits. The commanding officer hesitated. Rules were rules, but a child was missing, and boundaries felt meaningless in the face of that kind of absence. They pushed forward. The team followed the path for nearly half a mile. It wound downward, through dense woods and uneven rock formations, until it abruptly ended at a shallow creek. On the other side, a wall of brambles blocked further progress, but what stood out most was the silence. The air felt unnaturally still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Dogs refused to go further. Cameras caught nothing but static, and after another fruitless day, the team reluctantly withdrew. That night, while reviewing Amelia's belongings again, Mark unzipped the front compartment of her school backpack, something he had overlooked a dozen times before, and discovered a folded piece of paper wedged before his inner lining. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. The message was brief. "Don't worry, I'll be back before dark." The handwriting was unmistakably hers, but something felt off. The letters, normally neat and rounded, were rushed and uneven. Below that line was a second one, scribbled almost like an afterthought. "Don't follow me." Mark stared at the note for nearly an hour. His first instinct was disbelief. Was it planted, a cruel prank? But no one had touched her bag since the day she vanished. No one but him. He brought the note to the police, who examined it carefully. The ink was faded but intact, the paper slightly crumpled but clean. It had likely been written the morning she left. "Do you think she planned to leave?" Kearns asked gently. "Maybe she ran away." Mark shook his head. "No, if she was planning something, she'd tell me. We were close." But the note suggested otherwise. The words carried a sense of forethought, even intention. And that disturbed him more than any theory of abduction. A few days later, a handwriting analyst confirmed the script matched Amelia's journal entries, but offered no clarity about its meaning. "It reads like a reassurance," she said, "but paired with that second line, it sounds more like a warning." The team grew divided. Some believed Amelia had wandered off intentionally and gotten lost. Others feared she had met someone who persuaded her to leave. The forest, ancient and vast, offered both possibilities and none at all. Mark couldn't let go of the path Kearns had found. Something about it haunted him. The way it appeared suddenly, as if revealing itself only to those who dared look beyond the obvious. He returned alone 2 days later, retracing the steps the officers had taken. This time, he brought Amelia's dog, Jasper. The old collie had been restless since her disappearance, pacing the yard, staring toward the hills. As they reached the bramble wall, Jasper stopped, ears perked, nose twitching. Mark crouched, examining the base of the thorny barrier. Hidden among the leaves, nearly invisible unless you were searching for it, was a tiny red thread, nylon, synthetic, like the drawstrings on Amelia's favorite hoodie. His heart pounded. He didn't dare disturb the site without backup. He snapped a photo and marked the tree with his pocket knife before heading back down. When he showed the thread to the police, they agreed to reopen the restricted section of the search. Drones were dispatched, thermal imaging was used, but the terrain offered little to work with. The forest floor was a chaotic tapestry of roots, shadows, and dead ends. Still, something had changed. The investigation felt alive again, infused with momentum. Yet despite these new efforts, no further traces were found. It was as if Amelia had passed through a doorway that no one else could see. That thought kept Mark awake at night. One evening, while flipping through her old sketchbook, Mark stumbled upon a small, roughly torn page tucked between two drawings. On it was a map, hand-drawn, childlike, but eerily detailed. It showed their property, the nearby hills, the creek, and something marked far to the west, a circle labeled only with the letter R. He didn't know what it meant. Ridge? Refuge? Turn? He took it to Sergeant Kearns, who stared at it silently before pointing to a spot on the same topographic map they'd been using. "That's here," he said, tapping near the place where the hidden trail had ended. "That's exactly where we stopped." Mark felt something shift inside him, a new certainty. Amelia hadn't wandered off aimlessly. She had been headed somewhere she already knew, somewhere she thought she could reach on her own. And if that was true, then maybe the renewed interest in the Western Trail sparked a brief resurgence in search efforts, and for the first time in months, the hills were once again filled with the voices of people calling out Amelia's name, their feet crunching through dry leaves and moss, their hope thin but persistent. Among the volunteers was Liam Harrow, a 27-year-old biology graduate from Edinburgh who had returned to his childhood town for the summer and felt compelled to help. Liam had grown up hearing stories of Galloway's deep woods, tales of ancient paths and forgotten places, and though he didn't believe in folklore, there was something about Amelia's disappearance that unsettled him. On the second day of the renewed search, Liam was assigned to the northern edge of the reserve, a patch of forest that bordered the old quarry, dense with pine and rarely visited. He carried a walkie-talkie, a water pack, and a small journal where he'd been noting anything strange, even if only to ease his own nerves. Around 2:47 p.m., he radioed in, his voice unusually calm but curious. "Control, this is Unit 6. I think I just heard someone call my name from the tree line, northeast side." That was the last anyone heard from Liam Harrow. A search was launched immediately, faster than the one for Amelia had ever been. Dozens combed the area where his last signal had pinged, and his journal was found near a split pine tree, pages fluttering in the breeze. The final entry read, "The voice knew my name." But there was no sign of Liam himself, no clothing, no blood, not even footprints leading away. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole. The coincidence was too much for many to ignore. Two disappearances in the same region, years apart, both without logical explanation. Rumors flourished. Some whispered about Amelia's ghost, others hinted at cults or criminal hideouts. The police publicly dismissed the connection, stating the terrain was dangerous and disorienting. But off the record, even Sergeant Kearns admitted, something's not adding up. Mark, devastated by this second disappearance, became more glacio, retreating into his shed, poring over old maps and newspaper clippings. He rarely spoke except when necessary, and the once busy home on the edge of the Galloway woods grew quiet, almost sterile. Helen, his wife of 6 years and Amelia's stepmother, tried to hold things together. She made tea Mark never drank, cooked meals that went untouched, and spoke to friends who stopped calling. It was during one of those long, silent evenings that Helen sat alone on the back porch, staring into the shadows of the trees where Amelia used to play. The guilt had gnawed at her for years, but Liam's vanishing broke something loose. That night, she walked into the shed and handed Mark a sealed envelope. "I need to show you something," she said, voice shaking. Mark looked up, eyes wary. "What is it?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she sat down, clutching the arms of the old chair as if afraid she might float away. "The night before Amelia disappeared," she began slowly, "you two fought. I never told you. She came into the kitchen afterward, crying. She said she didn't want to go up the hill the next morning, that she didn't feel safe. Mark's expression hardened. "What are you saying?" "She said you were angry, that you yelled at her for not locking the barn gate. She said she didn't trust you anymore, that you never listened." Mark stood, suddenly pale. "Why are you telling me this now?" Helen looked at him, tears pooling. "Because I should have told you then, because it might matter now. I thought she was just upset. Kids say things." "But what if she meant it? What if she didn't go missing by accident? What if she left because of us?" Mark didn't speak. He stared at the envelope, then tore it open. Inside was a second note, one he had never seen before. It had been slipped into the spine of Amelia's old sketchbook, unnoticed for years. The handwriting was hers. It said simply, "If I go, it's because no one heard me." The words hit down slowly, the paper trembling in his fingers. He read it again and again, as if the meaning might change with repetition, but it didn't. It stayed sharp and final, like a blade. Over the next few days, Helen tried to apologize, but Mark withdrew further, consumed now not only by loss, but by the sickening weight of missed signs, of things said too late. He began revisiting Amelia's old notebooks, searching for coded messages, hidden meanings, anything he might have overlooked. The pages were filled with normal teenage musings, but every now and then a line would jump out, brittle and strained. "The forest listens when people don't. I like the silence there more than here. Maybe if I go far enough, someone will come looking for me." He wasn't sure if she had been crying out for help or plotting escape. The ambiguity was worse than either truth. And then there was Liam. His disappearances reignited theories, and a small group of online sleuths formed a community dedicated to the Galloway vanishings, poring over digital maps and government records. One user, a former cartographer, posted an old trail map from the 1970s, showing a logging road near the northern pines that no longer appeared on modern documents. "That area's been closed off for decades," he wrote, "officially for conservation. But what if it was for something else?" Mark printed the map and marked the same all Amelia had once drawn. The locations nearly overlapped. Something was hiding in those woods. Not a person, perhaps, but a truth. A reason, a decision made by a girl who felt invisible, and maybe by a man who had chosen to forget how loud he once yelled. But now, with another person gone, with another note unearthed, the past refused to stay buried. Mark knew he couldn't turn back. The next step was north, toward the forgotten logging trail, and whatever waited beyond the old pine. A full decade had passed since Amelia vanished into the mist of the Galloway Hills, and though her name was no longer spoken daily, her absence lingered like fog over the Ford household. The walls no longer held her laughter, the staircase no longer echoed with her quick steps, and her bedroom had become a makeshift storage room, filled with dusty boxes and quiet guilt. Mark Ford had aged beyond his years, his once dark hair now streaked with silver, his face drawn with the weight of too many unanswered questions. Helen tried to move forward in the only way she knew, by organizing a memorial service. "It's time," she had said gently, "for us, for Thomas." Mark had resisted at first, unwilling go, but eventually agreed. The service was held in the backyard beneath the old oak tree, with neighbors, friends, and even some former search volunteers in attendance. Candles flickered in the soft breeze, and a framed photo of Amelia, smiling, windswept, sat on a table draped in white linen. People spoke in hushed voices, offering stories, prayers, and moments of silence. It was supposed to be closure, but for Mark it only reopened wounds. After the gathering, as guests departed and twilight settled over the hills, Thomas, now 15, lanky and curious, volunteered to help clean the attic. He had been only 5 when his sister disappeared and had grown up under the heavy shadow of a sibling turned legend. While sorting through boxes of outdated electronics and forgotten books, he discovered a flat wooden case wedged between 2 beams. It looked like an artist's portfolio, bound with cracked leather and fastened by a thin metal clasp. Inside he found drawings, hundreds of them. They were Amelia's, unmistakable in their whimsical lines and swirling colors. Forest scenes, stars, strange rock formations, and toward the back, a folded map. The paper was thick and yellowed, the edges curled. In one corner, drawn in bold red ink, was a circle labeled Thomas brought the map downstairs, eyes wide with excitement. "Dad," he said, placing it on the kitchen table, "look at this." Mark, still dressed in black from the memorial, leaned over the map. The name stirred something in his memory. He'd heard it before, whispered once by an old ranger, mentioned offhand in a decades-old newspaper. Ridge Hollow wasn't on any official topographic survey. It didn't appear on Google Maps, but Amelia had known about it. She'd drawn it herself, and she'd marked it with precision. 2 days later, Mark stood at the edge of the forest, clutching the map and a flashlight. He hadn't told Helen where he was going. He needed to do this alone. The trail was overgrown, but the landmarks matched: a forked cedar, a stone outcropping shaped like a sleeping dog, and, finally, a flat clearing surrounded by trees so tall they blotted out the afternoon sun. The place was eerily quiet. Birds didn't sing here. In the center of the clearing sat a moss-covered boulder, nearly 3 feet high and smooth on top, like it had been worn down by years of weather. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about it, but as Mark circled it, he noticed a faint glint beneath the moss. He knelt, scraped away the greenery, and revealed a rusted metal shackle, an old padlock embedded directly into the stone. No hinges, no seams, no trapdoor or entry point, just a lock, its loop threaded through a hole drilled cleanly into the rock. Mark stared, heart pounding. Who would place a lock in solid stone? And why? He tugged at it, but it didn't budge. It wasn't decorative, it was old, functional, but completely illogical. He pressed his ear against the rock, listening, half expecting the sound of machinery or water, but heard only his own breath. The lock was cold to the touch, its surface pitted and corroded by time, but the clasp was still intact, as though it had been checked regularly, maintained even. He stepped back and examined the ground. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there recently, and yet the moss around the lock looked disturbed, as if it had been brushed aside, then replaced. Mark photographed everything: the rock, the lock, the surrounding area. He spent another hour exploring the clearing, looking for any other clues, a buried door, a hatch, a hollow spot, but found nothing. Just trees and silence, and the odd sense that he wasn't alone. As the sky darkened, he reluctantly turned back, unsure of what he had found, only certain that it mattered. That night, he studied the photos under his desk lamp, zooming in on the lock, on the faint scratches near it. There were letters etched into the metal, almost invisible beneath the rust. He enhanced the image on his computer until the markings became clear. 1974, Mackinac Hollow. The year, but 1974 meant nothing to him, until he remembered a conversation with a former forest worker, years ago, who mentioned that the Ridge Hollow sector had been restricted after an incident in the 70s, one the government never publicly documented. Something about geological instability, or was it political? He couldn't remember. But now he had proof that someone had gone to great lengths to seal something, literally, within this forgotten corner of the forest. He printed the map again, tracing new lines, connecting Amelia's drawing with Liam's last known location, and the journal notes he'd collected over the years. A pattern began to emerge. Ridge Hollow sat at the nexus of multiple strange events: disappearances, odd noises, reports of lights in the woods, and now this lock. A lock with no door. At midnight, Mark returned to Amelia's room and sat on the floor, the map spread out before him, the photo of the padlock next to it. He whispered aloud, "Did you find it, Amelia? Did you come here? Is this where you meant to go?" He didn't expect an answer, but a sudden creak from the hallway made him freeze. He turned slowly, but the house was still to settling. Just the wind. He stayed up until dawn, poring over records, looking for anyone who might know more about Ridge Hollow, about the year 1974, about locks in places that shouldn't be locked. The deeper he searched, the stranger it became. No official documents, no news reports, but forum posts, whispers, scattered references. One in particular stood out, a cryptic entry on an old local history blog archived from 2008. Doors are made to be seen but never opened. Ridge Hollow keeps its secrets with iron teeth. And still, he didn't understand what lay beneath that stone, what secrets Amelia may have uncovered, or what they were meant to protect her from. The morning after he discovered the rusted padlock in the clearing at Ridge Hollow, Mark drove into the village and visited the local archive center housed in the back room of the Galloway Historical Society. The place smelled of mildew and dust, with yellowed files stacked high in battered cabinets and newspaper clippings curled at the edges like leaves in late autumn. He searched through records from the 70s, trying to find anything that explained the presence of that padlock or the reason Ridge Hollow had been marked in his daughter's map. Most of the files from that era were sparse, especially regarding that sector of the forest, but he eventually found a faded field report mentioning minor structural collapses near the hollow and a closure notice issued by the Forestry Department in 1974. It was brief, vague, and suspiciously unhelpful. No mention of what had been built or why it had been closed so permanently. As he stepped outside, sun low over the hills, he ran into Martha Caldwell, the former postmistress of Galloway, now in her 70s. She recognized him instantly. "You're Mark Ford," she said, not as a question, but a quiet fact. "Amelia's father." He nodded, too tired to respond with the usual politeness. But she didn't need pleasantries. She looked down at his hand, where he still clutched a photo of the lock, then back into his eyes. "I think I saw her once," she said slowly. "I think I saw her imagine it until now." Mark stiffened. "Where?" Martha pointed toward the footpath that led to the old mill road, just past the edge of the village, near the side that bordered Ridge Hollow. "It was early morning, misty, just like the day she went missing. I was taking out compost when I saw a figure, young, thin, maybe 13, maybe 15. She looked dirty, tired. She came out of the trees and asked me for water." Her voice was soft. "I turned to go inside, and when I came back, she was gone." Mark's mouth felt dry. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I thought she was just a traveler, maybe a lost hiker's kid. She didn't seem scared, just hollow. And after a minute I convinced myself I hadn't seen her at all." Her voice broke, eyes glassy. "But now I wonder." What if it was her? Mark thanked her and walked away slowly, heart hammering in his chest. If Martha was right, Amelia had survived at least 7 years after vanishing. She had made it out. She had been close, so painfully close to home, and no one had known. No one had listened. Back at the house, Mark pulled out the stack of files he'd begun collecting on local disappearances, searching for anything that echoed Amelia's case. One report stood out. Dated August 1995, a boy named Callum Brody, age 10, had gone missing while hiking with his father in the Southern Ridge Trails. The file was thin, too thin, and ended with the same frustrating phrase, "Presumed lost due to terrain. No body, no evidence, just vanished." The father, Walter Brody, had been leading the hike that day. A former forestry worker, retired early, moved out of the area within 6 months. Mark remembered the name. Walter had been one of the volunteers during the first few weeks after Amelia's disappearances. He'd helped lead searches near the streams and higher ridgelines, but something about him had always seemed off. Calm, too calm, and oddly precise in his decisals. He'd told Mark back then, "She's gone, mate. If the hills take you, they keep you." Mark hadn't paid much attention to the statement then, chalking it up to fatalism. But now it felt like something else entirely. Digging deeper, Mark found that Walter Brody had been the first volunteer to formally withdraw from the search, citing personal burnout. No one questioned him. After all, he'd lost a son. But what if he knew something he hadn't shared? Mark drove 2 hours to a small coastal town where Brody now lived, tracking him down to a warm bungalow overlooking the sea. Walter answered the door with a cane in hand and a guarded expression. "Leave to talk to you about Amelia," Mark said without preamble. Walter's face remained unreadable. "That was a long time ago." "Not long enough," Mark snapped, holding out the file on Callum. "And not if you know what happened." For a moment, the old man said nothing. Then he stepped aside and let Mark in. They sat in a kitchen that smelled of salt and wood polish, the ocean humming faintly outside the window. "I found something at Ridge Hollow," Mark said. "A lock, built into stone. Do you know anything about that?" Walter's hand tightened around his cane. "I know Ridge Hollow's not what it seems. That's why it was—" "What does that mean?" Walter sighed, a deep, defeated sound. There's a reason they closed that forest. Something went wrong. Not supernatural, not demons or ghosts, just wrong. People built things where they shouldn't have. Underground experimental storage projects no one was supposed to know about. And the children? Walter looked away. My boy wandered close. I never found him, but I think he found something he shouldn't have. And when your girl went missing, I didn't want to believe it could happen again. Left, Mark said bitterly. You gave up. I couldn't lose another child, Walter whispered. Even if it wasn't mine. Mark left without another word. The drive back felt longer, the road more winding. He had more questions than answers, but the map now made sense. Ridge Hollow had been the site of something buried, something abandoned, and now 2 children, maybe more, had walked too close to its secrets. And somehow, one had returned. Briefly. Seen and unseen, that night Mark retrieved the map from his desk and stared at the markings, the strange symbols, the place Amelia had circled. Her drawing of Ridge Hollow hadn't just been a location, it had been a message. A place she reached, or maybe a place she had escaped from. And the lock? What if it wasn't? To keep people out. What if it was to keep something or someone in? Autumn descended on Galloway with a quiet grace, painting the hills in hues of amber and rust, the trees whispering with each breeze, as if the forest itself were remembering. Mark waited until the first frost to return to Ridge Hollow, knowing the thinning foliage would offer clearer sightlines and fewer distractions. He packed deliberately, flashlight, gloves, notebook, and a small pry bar. He didn't tell Helen or Thomas. He needed silence, and above all, clarity. The air was sharp as he climbed the familiar slope, the map now memorized, the steps engraved into muscle memory. When he reached the clearing where the rusted lock had been embedded in stone, he stood still for several moments, breathing deeply, grounding himself. The lock remained in place, untouched, defiant. But he wasn't there for the padlock this time. He began to search the surrounding area, tracing arcs outward from the stone-like rings from a dropped pebble. Hours passed, and the sun moved low behind the trees. Then, just as he was about to circle back, his boot sank into something soft, not moss, but rot. He knelt quickly and brushed away the decayed leaves and soil, revealing the edge of a wooden plank, nearly 2 feet wide, warped and discolored by years underground. He cleared more until the full shape emerged, a rectangular shape of wood, old but intact, camouflaged by the forest's natural decay. It didn't appear to be part of any structure, but when he knocked on it, the hollow echo beneath sent adrenaline surging through his veins. He wedged the pry bar into the seam and pulled. The wood groaned and splintered, lifting slowly to reveal a dark cavity beneath an entrance. Not a tunnel, not a trap door, but a stone-lined cavity dug into the hillside, just deep enough to serve as shelter. The smell hit him first. Damp earth, mildew, faintly metallic. He clicked on his flashlight and shone it inside. Cobwebs danced in the beam, dust swirling. The space was no larger than a crawlspace, maybe 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide, with uneven walls of rock and soil. He lowered himself carefully, feeling the cold of the stone seep through his gloves. Then he saw it, near the back, tucked against the corner. A small wooden box. He reached for it slowly, reverently, as if waking a memory. The box was hand-carved, its edges rough but deliberate, the kind a child might make in woodshop. He opened it. Inside were 4 items: a notebook thick with dampened pages, a crudely sewn cloth doll with mismatched button eyes, a small pocket knife, the kind sold in camping aisles, and a strip of red fabric, nylon, frayed at the ends, stained with something dark. Mark's breath caught. These weren't remnants, these were hers. The doll was unmistakable. Amelia had made it the year before she vanished, using scraps from old clothes and stuffing from a torn pillow. She'd named it Bean, after the family dog they'd once had. He lifted it gently, the weight of it heavier with time and meaning. The knife was one he'd given her for her 12th birthday, engraved with her initials, AF, barely visible now, but meet the tarnish. And the fabric, he realized with a jolt, was the drawstring from her favorite hoodie, the one she'd worn the morning she disappeared. His hands shook as he opened the notebook. The first page bore her handwriting, familiar and fragile. "If you find this, I'm sorry." The words blurred as his vision clouded. He turned the pages slowly, reading bits and fragments, entries describing cold nights, animal sounds, fear, and hunger. One page detailed how she'd found this hollow by accident while hiding from something she wouldn't name. Another talked about days spent waiting for someone to come, the way her ears would play tricks, turning wind into voices. The tone shifted over time, entries growing shorter, the handwriting more erratic. One final page stood alone, smeared and nearly illegible. I can hear them at night. If I stay still, they don't come close. I miss home. I miss Dad. Mark pressed the notebook to his chest, the weight of a decade collapsing into that one sentence. She had survived. For how long? He didn't know. But long enough to hope, long enough to write. He examined the walls again, looking for more clues, scratches, symbols, anything. There were faint carvings along the stone, simple hash marks, likely tracking days, maybe weeks. 68 lengths in total. 2 months. She'd lived here for 2 months, after everyone had given up. He climbed out slowly, clutching the box like it contained her heartbeat. Above ground, the sky had turned a muted gray, the forest quiet but alert. He looked back toward the clearing, then beyond, toward where the path led deeper into Ridge Hollow. The box told one part of the story, but the rest, the reason she never made it home, what she feared, what she heard at night, remained buried. Mark returned home in silence, placed the box on Amelia's bed, and sat beside it for hours. When Helen entered and saw the contents, she didn't speak. She sat beside him, tears falling without sound. Thomas stood in the doorway, unsure if he was allowed to approach. But Mark beckoned him in, opened the notebook again, and pointed to the page with Amelia's final message. The three of them sat there, 3 shadows of a family, breathing together in the space she had left behind. The next morning, Mark returned to the site with a shovel and a lantern, determined to search further. He marked every tree, every stone, documenting the hollow's location precisely. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the lock in the clearing, the one set into stone, was somehow connected to this hiding place. Ridge Hollow was not random. Amelia had chosen it for a reason. She had feared something enough to stay hidden, and she had left clues, hoping someone might find them one day. At sunset, while resting beside the stone with the embedded padlock, he noticed something new. The moss on the opposite side had thinned slightly, revealing a circular groove in the earth, almost like the lid of a buried container. He crouched, brushed away more debris, and realized the stone wasn't solid all the way through. It was a cap. Something was beneath it, and he now held the piece of her that might unlock everything. In the days that followed the discovery of Amelia's hollow, Mark immersed himself in the contents of her journal, transcribing each page by hand, trying to preserve the fragile script before time finished what decay had started. He read slowly, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence, and with every word, the narrative of her disappearance shifted from tragedy to something more intricate, more human. The entries began weeks before she vanished, detailing her life with an honesty that stung more than any unanswered question. Amelia wrote about the tension in the house, the distance growing between her and her father after her mother's death, the confusion she felt watching him grow closer to Helen, a woman who had entered their lives first as a neighbor, then as a friend, and then as something more. She described the night before she left, how she had overheard Mark on the phone confirming their engagement, a decision made without her knowledge, let alone consent. That betrayal burned in her words. She confronted him that night. He denied hiding anything, but she could see the truth in his eyes, and worse, the guilt. "It felt like I was being replaced," she wrote, "like she was moving into my mother's place, and he didn't even ask if I was okay." They argued. It escalated, voices rose, plates were left unwashed. She packed her bag, not out of fear, but out of defiance. She didn't run away to escape. She left to be heard. "I wanted him to worry," one entry said. "Just for a few hours. Just long enough to understand he can't make decisions without me." She took food, her knife, her doll, and the notebook, planning only to go as far as the hills, spend a day out alone, then return at dusk. But dusk never came. According to her entries, on the second day out, she realized the mist had settled in thicker than she expected. Disoriented but still calm, she circled back toward what she believed was the southern trail. It wasn't. It was the old animal path toward Ridge Hollow. She wrote of finding the stone padlock and feeling drawn to the area, describing it as quiet in a way that made everything else feel loud. She spent 2 nights near the clearing, unsure how far she'd strayed. On the 3rd day, she attempted to return, but while navigating a narrow ridge, her foot gave way on a moss-covered rock. She fell hard and slid into the cavity Mark had discovered a decade later. She broke no bones, but the impact stunned her. When she finally called for help, she realized the mouth of the hollow had been overtaken by creeping vines and thick bramble. No one could see her. No one could hear her. The following entries were filled with the raw chronicles of survival. She rationed her supplies, drank from rainwater collected in a torn fabric scrap, and used her small knife to cut roots and edible plants she remembered from school lessons. She named the days, tried to keep a schedule. She wrote letters in the margins, some to Mark, others to her mother. "I forgive you," one note said simply, though it didn't say who it was addressed to. Some pages were pure routine, lists of meals, sketches of forest birds she could glimpse through cracks in the stone, but others bled with emotion, loneliness, regret, fear. By week 5, her tone shifted again. The defiance was gone. "I think I hear them calling sometimes," she wrote, "but I'm too weak to yell. Maybe if I sleep less, I'll hear more." On the final complete page, she drew a picture. The house, the 3 of them on the porch, even Helen. Underneath, just 2 words, "I tried." Mark read those last words over and over, unable to breathe, unable to move. He had believed for so long that she had been stolen from him, erased by some cruel force beyond control. But she had left because of him, because he had moved on too fast, spoken too little, and listened even less. The truth wasn't hidden in conspiracy or myth. It was simple. It was heartbreaking. He kept the journal locked in the drawer of her old desk, but carried a copy in his coat pocket everywhere. He memorized her words. At night, he sat on the porch and read aloud passages to the trees, to the wind, hoping somehow she could hear. But something still nagged at him. One of the entries mentioned a second location, a place below the trees where the ground breathes. Amelia had found another hollow, she said, deeper and cooler than the one where Mark had found her box. She described it vaguely, but enough for him to triangulate based on her references to landmarks. He returned to Ridge Hollow again, this time with Thomas, who had insisted on helping. The boy was quiet but resolute, carrying a lantern and a spade. They searched for hours before finding a slight dip in the forest floor, almost imperceptible. When they dug, they found something unexpected. Not a cave or tunnel, but a narrow slit between boulders, wide enough for a child to squeeze through, not an adult. Inside, only Thomas could fit. He went in, trembling, light bouncing off slick rock. 5 minutes later, he called out, "There's something here." When Mark pulled him out, Thomas held another box, smaller than the first, wrapped in plastic. Inside, they found torn pages from the notebook, a broken pencil, and a locket. The locket held a photo of Amelia and Mark, taken the summer before she vanished, her hand clutching his arm, her face half smile, half worry. And at the bottom of the box, one final scrap of paper. "If you ever find this, it means I didn't make it, but I tried. I waited. I'm not mad anymore, just tired. I hope someone finds me, love." Mark held the note until his hands cramped, until his fingers bled from gripping it too hard. The woods no longer felt vast. They felt like a memory, echoing everything he'd failed to say in time. The locket and the final note became sacred to Mark, symbols of a daughter who had not died in bitterness, but in hope, who had, even in her last recorded breath, believed he might come. And he had. Too late, yes, but he had come. As he read the last legible page of her journal for the 100th time under the faded light of her old desk lamp, his fingers paused on the final line, written in shaky but unmistakable script. "If Dad made it here, I forgive him." The words settled deep in his bones, heavier than any apology he had ever received in his life. He read them aloud, again and again, until they became a kind of prayer, a plea to the past. Forgiveness, he realized, didn't erase the years, but it wrapped them in something less jagged. The following week, Mark contacted the authorities, submitted Amelia's journal and the items he'd recovered. The media caught wind of the discovery, and suddenly their quiet village became the center of regional headlines. Father uncovers missing daughter's final days. Decade-old mystery reopened. Reporters crowded the path leading into Ridge Hollow. Mark spoke at a small press conference, voice steady, though his heart thudded painfully with every word. He did not share the entirety of the journal, not the personal entries, not the pages that whispered a girl's inner storm, but he revealed the fact: Amelia had survived, had left signs, had waited, and had died not as a faceless statistic, but as a child who loved, feared, hoped, and forgave. That night, as the noise of attention faded and the house stood once again in silence, Helen emerged from their bedroom with something clutched in both hands. Her eyes were rimmed red, her movements slow. She said nothing at first, merely extended her arms and offered the folded piece of paper to Mark. As he opened the paper, recognition struck him like a slap. It was Amelia's handwriting, more youthful, more fluid than the journal's final entries, but unquestionably hers. It read, "Dad, I'm angry you didn't tell me. I needed time, not silence. I don't know what I'll do tomorrow. I just need to be alone for a while. Please don't worry. I'll come back when I can breathe." Mark stared at the letter, the shape of the letters searing into his vision. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice barely audible. Helen sank onto the edge of the couch. "I found it in her room the next morning after she was gone. It was tucked inside one of her books. I was cleaning, panicking, looking for any clue, and I read it." "And I didn't show you?" Mark didn't speak. "Couldn't." "I thought," she said slowly, "I thought if you read it, you'd blame yourself, cancel the wedding, or worse, go after her and get hurt. I told myself she'd come back, that she just needed space, and when she didn't, it was easier to let it stay hidden. By then, it was too much a coward." The room was deathly quiet. Mark sat down, the letter still in his hand. He wanted to yell, to throw something, to scream that she had stolen time, that she had burned the only breadcrumb that might have brought Amelia home in those crucial first hours. But the fury inside him dulled, replaced by something darker: exhaustion. Not from Helen's betrayal alone, but from the mountain of witness that had grown year by year. "You let me think she'd just vanished," he said flatly. "You let me carry that." Helen nodded, tears streaming. "I know, and I deserve that. But she forgave you, Mark. She left that in the end." "Maybe she would have forgiven me, too." He shook his head slowly, the paper trembling in his hand. "That's not your forgiveness to ask for." She left the room, shoulders hunched, as if carrying the same years he had, but weighted now with the fresh ache of exposure. Mark remained still for hours, the note between his fingers, the past hanging in the air like smoke. That night, he returned to Amelia's room and placed the newly found letter beside the journal and the box from the hollow. He lit a candle, sat on her bed, and read both letters aloud. Then he whispered the words he had once thought he would never say again. "I hear you now. I'm sorry it took me so long." The next morning he called Thomas into the room. They sat together on the edge of the bed, and Mark shared everything: the fight, the letter, Helen's choice, the final journal pages. He let the boy ask questions, let the tears come, and for the first time in years, Mark spoke not as a grieving father, but as a man who was learning how to be whole again, even if scarred. Later that day, Mark returned to Ridge Hollow alone. He knelt beside the stone cap and placed a small wooden cross he had carved the night before into the soil. On it he had etched her name, the date of her birth, and below, the words from her journal: "If Dad made it here, I forgave him." The forest was silent around him, but he didn't feel alone. The wind rustled the trees gently, the same way Amelia once did when she dashed through the backyard with a kite, or chased Jasper down the hill. He closed his eyes and remembered her voice, not the fading echo it had become in his dreams, but clear and close, full of life. As he stood and began to walk back toward the trail, he paused and looked over his shoulder one last time. Ridge Hollow wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a memory. A glaive, a place where silence had held truth longer than it should have, and now, finally, it had spoken. But somewhere deeper within the forest, beneath roots older than memory, the lock still remained embedded in stone. still unopened, still waiting. What began as a quiet morning turned into a finer storm. As news of Amelia's journal and final messages spread, the community that had once come together during the early days of her disappearance began to fracture. The first signs emerged at the town hall meeting convened by local officials, ostensibly to discuss forest safety in light of Ridge Hollow's remained attention. Mark sat quietly at the back, next to Thomas, while Helen remained home, uninvited and likely unwelcome. It would have been a procedural gathering quickly unraveled. An elderly man stood and demanded answers. Why had the hollow not been searched thoroughly in the beginning? Why had key areas been dismissed? Others joined in, their voices rising in collective frustration. Then someone turned their attention toward Mark. "You were her father," said a voice from the left aisle, a former schoolteacher whose daughter had been in Amelia's class. "How did you not notice something was wrong? She was a child." Mark took the words without reaction. He'd rehearsed them himself 1,000 times. But then came others. A young woman spoke up, tears in her voice, defending him. "He's not the only one who failed. We all did. No one checked that part of the woods. No one listened to her." The room split. Some blamed Mark for emotional negligence, for pushing Amelia away. Others blamed Helen, excusing her of deceit for withholding the letter, for protecting her future instead of her stepdaughter's safety. Some people began avoiding the Fords altogether. Others brought flowers and meals as though torn between anger and empathy. But it was the arrival of Lydia Grant that turned the local tragedy into something national. She was a journalist with the Yorkshire Sentinel, known for her investigations into institutional failures and cover-ups. She'd read the initial story and driven down unannounced, her instincts triggered not just by Amelia's case, but by something else. Familiarity. Within a week she published an article titled "How Many Amelias?", which chronicled her review of regional missing child reports over the last 30 years. Her research revealed a disturbing pattern. 12 cases, all within a 30-kilometer radius of Ridge Hollow, all involving children between the ages of 8 and 15, all categorized as presumed lost. All unresolved, the oldest dated back to 1982. The most recent, before Amelia's had, occurred in 2001, a boy named Dylan March who vanished while camping with his scout troop. The cases were scattered across county lines, filed by different jurisdictions, but Lydia's article stitched them into a single, chilling thread. Her conclusion was speculative but chilling. Either the region had a tragically high rate of child disappearances, or something else had been quietly buried, a systemic failure or a darker truth cloaked in bureaucratic neglect. The village responded with panic. Parents withdrew children from schools. Tourism vanished overnight. Police held a press conference promising to review historical cases, but stopped short of acknowledging a pattern. Mark watched it all unfold like a dream. He met Lydia in the small cafe across from the library where Amelia once spent her weekends. She was sharp, precise, but not cold. She laid out a map dotted with pins, showing the proximity of each case to Ridge Hollow. "You've opened something here," she told him, "and I don't think Amelia was the first." Mark stared at the pins, at the names he didn't recognize: Dylan, Sophie, Lucas, Maeve. Each one a ghost like his daughter, each one possibly calling out from beneath the canopy of the forest, unheard. "What are you suggesting?" he asked quietly. "I'm not sure," she said, "but someone knew." Lydia's investigation unearthed further irregularities: missing ranger logs from the late 90s, erased GPS records from a 1994 logging project, and an abandoned research permit issued to a shell corporation registered in Glasgow. Ridge Hollow, it seemed, had drawn interest before, but no one had asked why. The pressure grew. National news outlets picked up the story, government officials deflected, former officers claimed faulty record-keeping, and still the community spiraled. Half the town called for Ridge Hollow to be permanently sealed. The other half demanded it be excavated completely. Mark became a reluctant symbol, a grieving father, a possible scapegoat, a quiet reminder of how deep pain can root itself in silence. Helen avoided town altogether, her shame too large to contain. Thomas walked with hunched shoulders, this time to public scrutiny and bitterness. But amidst the noise, Mark focused only on one thing: the padlock in the stone. The lock remained, a riddle untouched, its presence now infamous. No one could explain why it was there or what it protected, and in the shadow of Lydia's findings, it took on new menace. Was it merely symbolic, a relic of old forestry methods, or a barrier, an intentional seal? One morning, Mark awoke to find an envelope on his doorstep. Inside was a copy of a property deed dated 1973, marking Ridge Hollow as part of a temporary research zone approved by a long-defect government body. At the bottom was a handwritten note. They tried to bury more than land. No signature. No return address. He handed the documents to Lydia, who immediately recognized one of the names on the approval form, an engineer who had gone missing in 1985. The timeline tightened. The questions multiplied, and the village, once a quiet hillside refuge, now found itself under siege from its own buried secrets. Winter came early that year, the air sharpening by late October, and the leaves falling in rapid succession like a surrender. The Ridge Hollow excavation, forced by public pressure and Lydia's relentless reporting, began under gray skies and a weight of expectation. For weeks, teams of geologists, forensic experts, and archaeologists carefully peeled back layers of moss, soil, and secrets. Mark visited the site daily, sometimes joined by Thomas, often alone. He didn't speak to the crews. He simply watched, hands in coat pockets, waiting for a truth he feared and needed in equal measure. Then, on a brittle morning, near the edge of the old growth line, 300 meters west of the hollow where Amelia had written her final words, a forensic dog alerted at a depression in the ground. Within hours, the crew uncovered skeletal remains, small, fragile, curled in a fetal position beneath a blanket of collapsed earth and vine roots. The remains were clothed in decayed fabric that matched what Amelia had worn the day she left. Near the ribs lay the broken strap of her backpack, and beneath one hand, still clasped even in death, was the head of the doll named Bean. DNA confirmation came 3 days later. It was Amelia. The coroner's report suggested she had exited the hollow at some point, possibly in her final days, attempting to find help, but had collapsed before reaching safety. Exposure, compounded by malnutrition and exhaustion, had likely claimed her. She had been so close that Mark, had he walked 30 more steps on that first day of search, might have seen her, might have saved her. The guilt settled like frost on his bones. The official funeral was small. Mark refused press, refused the speeches offered by local leaders, refused the camera crews stationed down the hill. He carried the small wooden urn himself, placed it into the ground himself, and carved the gravestone by hand. Amelia Ford. Lost. Lost? Heard at last. Life in Galloway staggered forward. Ridge Hollow was sealed permanently, fenced and monitored, its ground declared unstable and off-limit. But rumors still swirled, of rooms yet to be found, of disappearances connected by invisible threads, of government names whispered but never spoken aloud. Lydia left town shortly after publishing her final report, which concluded not with accusation, but with a plea for vigilance. "The woods do not forget," she wrote, "but we must not let them be the only ones who remember." Mark returned to work briefly, helping out with odd jobs around the village, but he rarely spoke. He let Helen go without protest. She moved to another county, her absence acknowledged only by a brief note and a forwarding address Thomas never used. Mark and his son shared meals in silence, their grief shared differently but no less binding. Then, on the first snowfall of the next winter, Mark vanished. It was a Tuesday. He had gone up into the hills, telling no one, leaving only a single note on his kitchen table, scribbled on the back of one of Amelia's drawings. It read, "I found her. Now it's her turn to guide me the rest of the way." They found his truck parked near the base trail to Ridge Hollow, the door unlocked, engine cold. Rescue teams scoured the area for days, but the snow had come hard and fast, swallowing prints, freezing time. No sign of him was ever recovered, not a glove, not a footprint, not a scarf. Some said he walked into the storm by choice, not to escape, but to reunite. Others insisted it was an accident, a misstep made by a tired man in the grip of sorrow. But Thomas, now 16, believed otherwise. He believed his father had walked the same path Amelia had, not to vanish, but to be found, by something more than headlines or judgment. A year later, Thomas stood alone at the edge of the clearing, the wind biting, the silence vast. He carried no flashlight, no tools, just the notebook, the one his sister had written in, the one his father had held like scripture. He placed it atop the moss-covered stone where the padlock still sat, untouched, and whispered, "You can rest now." He turned and walked back down the trail, not looking over his shoulder, not fearing what lay behind. The forest watched him go, quiet and still, and somewhere, deep in its memory, the wind curled around two names it would carry forever, Amelia and Mark, bound not by death, but by forgiveness, silence, and the long, bitter path of return. If this story moved you, consider subscribing to the channel for more haunting mysteries like this one. What do you think really happened to Amelia during those final days? Was there something deeper hiding in Ridge Hollow? And where are you watching from? Are these woods near your home, or does this mystery feel worlds away? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one.